Isonzo, how demanding is it to run on a PC? Let's find out. The listed requirements are divided into minimum and recommended. Sadly, there is no distinction what each will guarantee. Is it 1080p 30 fps or 720p at 60 Hz? We do not know. Regardless, Isonzo can be played on any operating system, Mac included, which is very nice. Not the Mac part, but rather the Linux support. All tests were performed on Carso with bots using MSI Afterburner. On Windows 11, sadly I did not know that MSI Afterburner allows you to get averages as a report, so I guessed what they would be from the frame rate I got. So, Isonzo needs a strong 4-core CPU, 8GB of RAM and a GPU with 4GB of VRAM buffer. But is that true? Let's start with the CPU. I ran Isonzo on a 2-core 4-thread CPU, also known as i3 6100, with 8GB of RAM and a 3GB 1060. And the game ran at 1080p low without major issues, at around 60 FPS. But with the occasional lag, yet the GPU was not being fully utilized. Now let's compare this to a 4-core CPU of the likes of Ryzen 3 1200 with 32GB of DDR4 and again with the 1063GB. It ran similarly, yet the experience was smoother without the lag. Turning the settings to high did not change much. The frame rate was above 50, just the GPU utilization did increase. I did try out to mess with the cap for FPS within the game settings as well as with NVIDIA control panel, but sadly the utilization would not be 100%. But estimating a 1080p low, the max FPS should be between 110 and 120, while on high settings the approximation gives us at around 90 FPS. It is really a shame that the GPU was not fully utilized. The RAM was also not fully utilized, of course. At 32GB of RAM, the game consumed around 9GB, dropping to 16 did decrease the RAM usage to around 8.1 or 8.2GB, while the performance was the same. Lowering the RAM once again to just 8GB did make an impact to the game slightly. The constant FPS went from above 50 to around 45, and it was lagging from time to time. The consumption remained at 7.5GB. But I went a step further and I tested the game with just 4GB. Oh, the madman! Here the average FPS did not really drop, but it was much less consistent. Yet still kinda playable at around 40 FPS, but the lag was much worse. While the RAM usage reached all the way up to 3.8GB. Damn, it seems Windows 11 can stretch like a gymnast. Now let's focus on GPUs. Let's see how good does Isonzo run on the same Ryzen 1200 and 32GB of RAM with the iconic HD 7770. This mid-range graphics card from the early 2012 that supports a whole gigabyte of DDR5. At 1080p with low settings, the card achieved a little bit above 30 frames per second, which was surprising. Switching to medium settings felt like the game froze, but after some time it came back to life, but the FPS were cut in half and it felt like playing a PowerPoint presentation. Going to 1600 by 900 resolution on low settings, it netted us a solid 40 FPS and the game was kinda playable, not gonna lie. I also tried out to run it on 720p, there we did get more than 50 FPS, but you can clearly see the poor resolution, which is a deal breaker at least for me. Up next we have the RX 460, a 2GB entry-level GPU from 2016. Here, at 1080p low settings, we achieved around 50 frames per second, which is actually a decent show for an 8-year-old entry-level card. Turning the resolution down to 900p, again on low settings due to the VRAM buffer limit, we saw around 60 FPS, while at 720p we got around 70, but it was fluctuating quite a bit. At 32GB, the RAM utilization was around 9GB with the GTX 1060 as mentioned before, but the RX 460 used 10.5 and 11.5 RAM usage with the HD 7770, as the cards did not have enough VRAM and stuff had to be stored in RAM instead. So, what do you need to play Isonzo? By play I mean that it runs and you can play casually on 1080p, low settings, so any 2-core 4-thread CPU, but ideally a 4-core should do the trick. 8GB of RAM are enough, though 16 is preferable, and for the GPU you want to have more than 2GB of VRAM and something a bit stronger than the RX 460, so an RX 470 or similar on the AMD side, while for Nvidia a GTX 950 with 4GB should do the trick. Though I wonder how would the RX 460 or 560 with a 4GB buffer run the game. Powerful older gen cards should work well too. Upscaling requires a bit more VRAM than 1 or 2GB, which is not enough, and if you will turn it on, it will actually give you worse performance, not to mention the visual quality will be shit. So that's it. I do hope this gives you a better idea of what you need to run Isonzo. That's all, and I will see you all on the battlefields. Gaming Teacher out.